If you're struggling to make sense of what's going on in Russia, you're not alone. Recent events have left many questioning the state of the regime, but also wondering, can we know what's really going on in Russia? In today's video, we'll talk about the challenges of reporting on Russia and what we can and cannot know about the regime with OSW expert Maria Domańska.
This strange mutiny showed us actually the limitations of our expertise, the limitations of also our access to credible information. Because out of the blue, something that seemed like a typical intra-elite fighting turned out to be the most serious threat to the stability of Putin's regime since, I would say, the end of Chechen wars, let's say. So for the last many years, Putin seemed a super powerful leader who controls totally everything and also is able to continue with his divide and rule strategy without creating any particular risks for his position and for his rule. And all of a sudden, it turned out that something that seemed totally irrational based on emotions caused a serious crisis of power in Russia. Those who were honest admitted that they didn't understand much of the situation. Collecting information in this situation is extremely difficult because you have plenty of news. You don't know which ones are credible. You don't have time or sometimes tools to verify them. And if you think about it in a rational way, we just couldn't predict it because it was so, contrary to the whole logic of the system. All of us have many years of experience and collecting many pieces of the broader puzzle, like week by week and year by year. And then it turns out that simply this over-centralized regime is not able to control quite basic things, in fact. We knew, for example, that Russia's apparatus of repression is quite powerful. I mean, that's what we saw when we followed the repression against the liberal opposition or peaceful protesters in the streets. Now we saw the situation when 4,000 or 5,000 of armed men seize two big cities in Russia, and they continue their march on Moscow. And it wasn't any kind of a planned coup d'etat or whatever. It was just something that got out of control. And unfortunately, a situation is not going to be easy for us because if this system is getting more and more unstable or more and more uncontrolled by the Kremlin, it means that we can face similar crises in the future. It doesn't mean that this system will collapse soon, but we will be confronted with this necessity of analyzing things that will be very hard to analyze and understand.
Apart from the mounting difficulties in interpreting ongoing events, there are limitations to reporting on Russia that have always been a challenge.
Well, actually, we have quite a lot of information. The problem is that we cannot always verify whether this information is credible or not. And we also lack a lot of necessary information to build the whole picture. The example I always like to give is that if you are an analyst working on Canada or France or Germany or the US, you have access to the state officials of various levels. You have access to independent journalists who work freely on the ground and no one represses them, no one limits their work. You have access to more or less credible statistical data and sociological data, and you also can visit the country you work on. We don't have anything of this kind in the case of Russia. I mean, we cannot visit Russia anymore. We haven't had access to the state officials for a long time now. Independent media that are mostly in exile now with some networks of journalists on the ground are struggling for survival under the wartime censorship and the state repression machine. One of the most credible and leading Russian independent media outlets, Novaya Gazeta Europe, has been declared undesirable, an undesirable organization by the authorities, which means that it is now illegal to be a journalist working with Novaya Gazeta. So if you are a journalist and you help Novaya Gazeta to collect information from Russia, and you are on the Russian territory, you may be arrested and put in jail for many years, actually. So this seriously undermines the work of independent media. We also don't have access to credible statistical data. We don't know actually what is the actual state of the Russian economy because the data are falsified at different stages of collecting and processing them, let's say. We also don't have access to any fully credible sociological data because sociological surveys in Russia, well, let's say they reveal some phenomena, they reveal some trends, but we can't be sure about the numbers. What percentage of respondents actually think or want something or not. And still, we are trying to do our best to collect these small pieces of the puzzle.
Despite these limitations, there are still ways to reach credible information.
Well, we have access to open sources of information, so we have access to independent media, and this is our first source. With all limitations they are struggling with, they are quite credible, and also there is a group of journalists you can trust. Then you have social media, and you can monitor social media, and from there you can understand what ordinary people think in Russia. So social media can be both our ally and challenge. The problem is that you have to very carefully analyze which social media you can trust and who is totally incredible. And we know, for example, in some Telegram channels, you can't trust them at all because they spread all kinds of conspiracy theories and also probably some controlled leaks from inside the system. So if you don't want to be manipulated, you have to be very careful. You know more or less whom to trust, but the problem is much broader. There's huge competition in the social media, and algorithms also work against us often. Unfortunately, sometimes you cannot just be visible enough because there are plenty of other sources that are just more clickable because, for example, they spread conspiracy theories. The totally unverified information that is attractive, that is sensational, and people then turn to this kind of information. We have YouTube, which is still not blocked in Russia. And we have plenty of experts and journalists commenting the events on YouTube. It's impossible to follow everything, of course. But this is a very good source of information. There is also a growing Russian political diaspora abroad, and you can travel around the European Union and not only European Union and just try to meet these people and talk to them because they still have contacts with people in Russia, when the members of their families, their friends, and so on. So if they want to talk to you, you can learn a lot of really interesting things. You also have the official state propaganda, and this is a very tricky tool, but this is also a tool of analysis. I mean, you monitor the propaganda and you, for example, can understand what they are worried about, or you can figure out why they use this kind of narratives and not other kinds of narratives. Why they, for example, omit some topics or trying to wrap them in very specific words or formulations in order to achieve something. From state propaganda, you also can understand what kind of narrative the Kremlin is attempting to sell in the West, to employ, let's say, reflexive control, to influence somehow the decision-making processes in the West vis-à-vis Russia. For example, I think that unfortunately they have quite successfully sold us those narratives about, almighty Putin, the almighty powerful state security apparatus, or they also, unfortunately, were able to sell us successfully the narrative that they are ready to use nukes against us or against Ukraine. Or what is, I think, the worst thing they actually sold us is that without Putin, Russia will totally destabilize and collapse as a state, producing all kinds of super serious threats all over the world. When I talk with my colleagues from Western Europe, for example, or from the US, I see it clearly that most of them are really worried that if the authoritarian regime in Russia unravels in one way or another, we will have more challenges to face and more threats to face than now, which is really weird for me, because this Putin's super stability produced actually the most serious threats for European security since 1945. And still, many people believe that without Putin, the situation may be even worse. And there's no way to explain that, okay, maybe not. Maybe there are some other scenarios that would be much better without Putin than with Putin. This is really something very harmful to our current policies and to our future strategies. And my suggestion would be just to try to think out of the box and try to better understand the situation, the nuances in Russia, and also try to imagine those very bad scenarios and think also about how we can influence the situation using our toolkit, using our economic, political, and other tools. We can aspire to get that whole picture and to understand Russia in a holistic way, let's say, but I think it's impossible, at least as long as this regime is so oppressive.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more content like this one about the region. We have new videos out every week.